This is Jeffrey Tucker, Brownstone Institute. Today's show is going to explore all the revelations we found out concerning the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I will have as my guest Tyler O'Neill, the author of a 2020 book called Making Hate Pay, which presciently anticipated everything we're hearing about now. I have to tell from a personal point of view, I have a long history with SPLC. I've always known it was a bit of a scam, or a lot of a scam. They decades ago named me in one of their newsletters as an as being anti-government. Well, I had a hard time sort of disputing that. That seemed to be, yeah. I mean, I guess, but it's a strange. Their publication is strange because um, while they seem to be well researched, they always sort of lack. I don't know how to put it. Like it always lacks an argument. It's always just, oh, here's a bad guy, here's a bad guy, here's a bad guy. He's associated with this bad guy. This guy's a bad guy because he's associated with this other bad guy, and that's the report. Um, and it's strange because they make very little effort to put these people on a scale of evil. So they got extremely reckless, and of course, you've got the Klan and the various white nationalist groups, but then also they started sort of tagging what you think of as mainstream conservative organizations, Moms for Liberty, Turning Point USA, that sort of thing. But and it was strange because they never permitted anybody to sort of appeal the judgment, and of course the purpose was, in some sense, to sort of freeze the national debate and terrify people that they were going to get on the list. So they watch the P's and Q's and are happy so long as they're not on the list of haters. So they had a sort of distorting aspect on national life. So you're really afraid of what you're going to say. I mean, one wrong comment in one venue, one podcast, or one newsletter or whatever, and you've got the scarlet letter for life. And there's also a strange thing about them. I've always known that they work, as they say, worked with law enforcement. So was it a government organization or is it not? Are they friends with the federal government, or are they, like they claim to be, inheriting a tradition that was independent and emancipatory? So it was never really clear exactly what they were about, or what they were doing, or who was funding them, and why. And I used to work about 40 minutes up the road from their palace in Montgomery, Alabama. There's also a funny regional aspect to SPLC. Um, they located themselves in Alabama, and if you understand sort of the place that Alabama occupies in the national ethos, everybody north of the Mason-Dixon line thinks that to this day racism is abundant and obvious and on the streets everywhere, and the whole South is tainted by it, and particularly Alabama, because of the legends concerning civil rights resistance and that sort of thing. So SPLC was considered to be brave going into the heart of Dixie, uh, you know, the capital of Alabama, and setting up an aggressive building, which impressed people in the North who are happy to hold these views, frankly, wildly bigoted views towards the South, and so they sort of fundraised off that. So my skepticism dates way back, but I will tell you that in 2015, I had been working on a book that it was chronicling the dangers to the cause of human liberty, not just from the left, which is sort of well known, at least in my traditional thought, but from the right, which I thought was neglected in the literature. So I started with Hegel and 1820, and marched through uh, the rise of nationalism in the 19th century, and mercantilism, and then I went through the rise of the eugenics movement, And the more I wrote, the more I researched, the more I started getting maybe overly focused. This is what happens when you write a book. You get overly focused on that one topic to the exclusion of other topics. So I finished the book, and just as I was finishing, what do you know? The riots, the protests, in Charlottesville happened with the tiki torches and the dudes. That began as a protest against removing the statue of Robert E. Lee. And when Trump said there are good people on both sides, that's what he was referring to. He was talking about that dispute over the future of that statue. And his comments were wildly distorted. But still, the protest got insanely out of hand to the point that these guys were choosing night marches and walking around with tiki torches saying, they will not replace us, which mutated into Jews will not replace us. So it was like a paradigmatic example. I was like, oh, look at that. There's a movement in this country that has the flavor of exactly what I'm writing about. So when I went to print with that, I thought, well, I want to make this book really relevant. So I started with that. I started with the whole Charlottesville thing, and incredibly, I bought the whole bit. I mean, it might as well have been the New York Times. You're reading the introduction to this book. It's right, Charlottesville, bad right-wing, dangerous dudes are embodying exactly what this book is about. Biden, of course, used this incident. The whole country was in a frenzy. SPLC tripled, quadrupled their fundraising over this thing, and I was all in until very recently. The revelation came out that this thing was actually subsidized by the SPLC itself as a kind of fundraising venture. It's just the whole thing is just beyond belief to me. And so then I began to have to rethink everything, and everything I've read has caused me to rethink everything about this organization and the propaganda that it's dished out, and the way we think of this country, and my conception of, like, what are the real threats and dangers that it just. What I'm saying is that I, as a grave skeptic of SPLC, turns out to have been just the most naive, vulnerable guy, and bought a cooked line that they had gamed out at their Montgomery headquarters solely for fundraising purposes. I mean, once you think about this, your whole conception of not just that organization, but the public mind and American politics itself begins to shift. So that's why I brought Tyler here. Welcome, Tyler. So glad to have you.
Hey, glad to be here. I think it is important to say, when you said what you said about Charlottesville, which, is right on the money, but Charlottesville, there were still real, white nationalists there. So the fact that the SPLC was funding one of the organizers of Charlottesville, as horrible as that is, and as revealing as it should be to us, that Charlottesville was far worse than it otherwise would have been without the SPLC. That's the claim in the indictment. I think it's still important to say that there is an organic nature to that whole protest, that riot sort of thing, and that, obviously Biden, the SPLC, the left, weaponized it, took advantage of it to absurd degrees, and it nowhere is as revelatory of, especially of the right, as the left made it out to be. But I think in the pursuit of fairness, I do want to say that there were bad elements at Charlottesville.
Yeah, there were bad eggs there. And wow, I'm just going to jump right in. Do we know any more details about how much do you know about that incident in Charlottesville? And do you have a theory about who among the organizers might have been on the SPLC payroll? And by the way, as long as you're answering that, were there other feds present there?
I don't have any confirmed. I mean, I'm working mostly off of the indictment and the superseding indictment, the new details that came out. Many of us had been concerned for a while that Charlottesville looked like some sort of staged operation. I mean, there's an organization out there called Patriot Front, and we don't have proof of that this is, a fake organization, but it really stinks to high heaven. The way these people are always walking around with their masks, the way that, it seems as though if I were, it's like the Lincoln Project when they planted their racists at one of the Republican events in Virginia. I'm like, that looks more like Patriot Front than I want to admit. But at the same time, we don't have concrete proof. So we don't know how many FBI informants there were. We do know, thanks to the indictment, and the SPLC has not, the SPLC has pleaded not guilty. The SPLC has claimed that the indictment has falsehoods, but the SPLC acknowledged they have this informant program, and they said that they provided to the FBI a dossier about the Unite the Right rally before it happened. So, that's their defense. At the same time, they were funding one of the organizers and allegedly supervising his or her racist postings in the lead up to Charlottesville. So, I mean, this is the main thing I like to focus on with the SPLC is their incentive structure. And their incentive, as you noted, you've long been skeptical of this organization for good reasons. There are people on the left who have written very cogently about their concerns that this looks like a mail fraud operation. And, they've been exaggerating hate for decades. And the way that they do it, they have three ways that they do it. One of them is they emphasize groups that either don't exist or barely exist. One of my favorite examples is this Confederate sympathizer had a Confederate shop in some Mississippi town. And the SPLC puts it on the hate map, does a big spread about how he's welcomed by the community. And I'm like, okay, but he's just a kook. Nobody cares about this person. And their claim that he's relevant is that he participated in a showing of the Nutcracker locally. That's, you can't make this up.
This is just wicked. Yeah, this is just wicked. The other thing that people need to understand about the culture of the South is that, after the Civil War, there was a deal. You can be proud of your heritage. We'll be proud of ours, and we'll just call it we'll just go forward. We'll never deny you your rights to be proud of your war dead, and your ancestry. And that's so most of the like a shop. Where'd you say it was in Mississippi?
Yeah. Kennesaw, I think, wherever that is.
Yeah. So, a shop in some deep South town selling Confederate memorabilia is not calling for the South to rise again, except maybe in an ironic way. I mean, these people. This is not real. I almost feel sorry for the guy tagged. I mean, he's trying to sell, whatever, gray caps and stuff. I mean, for reenactors, I
mean, he's passed now, and the shop is closed. And one of the few things where the SPLC actually did take an organization off. There's a nunnery on there, by the way, that's still on the SPLC hate map. Because, supposedly these nuns are from a radical sect of traditional Catholicism, and their prayers might be a threat. We have to be, but we can mock those instances, and I think they're important to mock. But then we have to note that the SPLC also puts mainstream conservative and Christian groups on the hate map. Yeah. And this is what you highlighted earlier, Moms for Liberty. Yeah. Last year, they put Turning Point USA on the map, just a couple months before Charlie Kirk was assassinated. And, they put Family Research Council on the map. There was an attempted mass violent attack at the Family Research Council in 2012, where a man looked at the SPLC hate map, found the Family Research Council, went there, planned to slaughter everyone in the building, and smear a Chick-fil-A sandwich in their faces. And this guy, thankfully, the building manager, a man by the name of Leo Johnson, Leo the Hero he's named, he suffered lifelong injuries, but he wrestled the guy to the ground and prevented this terrorist attack. But the SPLC has kept Family Research Council on the hate map ever since. And they say that this hate map reveals the infrastructure upholding white supremacy in America.
Yeah.
That's a very damning claim. And that is, I mean, if you ask me, it's textbook defamation. We've seen lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit brought. Only a couple of them have been settled. One of them is still working its way through the courts right now because of New York Times v. Sullivan and the actual, really, I'd say it's the bastardization of defamation law that the Supreme Court unfortunately got into. And of course, I'm proud that we have strong First Amendment rights in this country. But there is, the bar to prove defamation is so absurdly high.
It is.
It doesn't fit the initial common law understanding of defamation
That's
that
right.
our founders would have understood.
Well, Tyler, they must produce databases that they distribute to big tech companies as a way of kind of exclude. And I'll tell you a quick story about this, because Moms for Liberty, which is a lovely organization, actually, they go out of the COVID period. They wanted their kids back in school, and without
what
vaccine, and without shot mandates for the COVID shot. It was basically an earnest, sweet organization of a nice Moms for Liberty. That's what they were for. But they somehow got on SPLC's radar, and then I suspect that SPLC is distributing a database of individuals and groups to tech companies around the country. Because soon after that, I had Tiffany Justice scheduled to speak at a separate club, and I back in those days I was using a technology called Eventbrite, right, a third-party plugin to manage my and Eventbrite. A week before she was coming to speak, I mean, just a nice lady speaking to some nice people, right? I mean, like 40 people, and Eventbrite canceled the list.
Eventbrite is one of the worst offenders on this. Yeah, their official policies say they will cancel any event that's associated with a group on the SPLC hate map.
Oh, they say that.
Yes, their policies say that. So there are a lot of these organizations. So yes, you're entirely right. And actually, this is a key example of how the SPLC weaponized Charlottesville. After Charlottesville, the SPLC launched like 3 or 4 different major initiatives. One of them was called Change the Terms, and this was working with Color of Change, the Center for American Progress, a whole host of organizations on the left. And they said, after Charlottesville, we have to silence figures on the right. And of course, they used the SPLC hate map as the key determining factor. And so this is in 2017. This is before Moms for Liberty even existed, much less was on the hate map. But this is still when, Alliance Defending Freedom, the Family Research Council, the Center for Immigration Studies, the Federation on American Immigration Reform, like many organizations that advocate for policy and have absolutely nothing to do with race, let alone white supremacy, let alone the Klan. These groups were unfairly tarred, systematically defamed. And then you had this coalition of leftist groups that said all social media companies should change their terms to prevent hate groups from abusing them. And this is a large coalition. But then there were other efforts. So the SPLC partnered with the Council on American Islamic Relations to do a campaign called Hate-Free Philanthropy, where they said, okay, these are a whole bunch of anti-Muslim groups. And of course, their anti-Muslim groups were groups that condemn Sharia supremacy, they condemn Islamism. And this is another debate. I think there might be some concerns that people have on civil liberties grounds with some of the claims that some of these groups have. But in general, when you're talking about Islam, it's a complicated, multifaceted religion, but there are elements in our country who want to bring Sharia law from the Quran and from the old understanding of the Hadith into American society in various ways. And so groups that warn against this, and by the way, some of these groups are Jewish groups, are put on the hate map of the SPLC, because the SPLC says you're vilifying all Muslims. And most of these groups are very clear that they're only talking about a specific type of Islam. But all that to say, like, this was an issue where the SPLC is working with CARE to blacklist people from receiving donor-advised funds from other charitable entities. And the other thing is Amalgamated Bank launched a campaign called Hate is Not Charitable is with CARE. Amalgamated Bank's one was, I can't remember the name, but it was a similar, like, debanking hate. And what they did was they gathered a group of donor-advised funds, NGOs, companies, and they said, look, Fidelity, Schwab, all your big banks, you need to debank these companies. You need to make sure that any NGO on the SPLC hate map can't receive donor-advised funds. So this is a systematic effort that the SPLC took in coalitions with many of its left-leaning allies to silence conservatives, to kick them out of the public square. And, to be fair, there are some radical groups that oftentimes barely exist and don't have political clout on the hate map that, I think do deserve to be watched. There's a group called Atomwaffen Division that, a few years ago, the DOJ convicted a man who was planning to carry out bomb attacks against, I think it was synagogues. So like there are hateful people that still exist in this country, but the SPLC takes that small amount of hate that does still exist and then blows it up. And now their latest report, they're saying hate is infiltrating the White House. Hate is testifying in Congress. I saw my own testimonies from last year. I testified before different congressional committees listed as examples of extremism infiltrating DC.
And it does have real effects. So your point, Grant, so just to be clear, there seems to be a plausible rationale for a group that in the public interest would monitor legitimate hate groups. But once that becomes weaponized, it becomes reckless, becomes dangerous, abusive, and then becomes just a sort of a fundraising racket, then you've got genuine problems. Especially when they inherit this sort of legacy of credibility for a lot of naive institutions like banks and Eventbrite and whatever. In our case, I had an event scheduled, and suddenly it was gone. And you think about this, like Tiffany Justice, who now she was working for the Heritage Foundation afterwards, and she maybe worked for the Trump administration. Now I'm not entirely sure, but what in the world could be wrong with having it? And by the way, Brownstone doesn't even advertise itself in any sense as like conservative. Like nobody would describe us that way. We're just, we grew out of the COVID period, and Tiffany has an interesting perspective and a fascinating story. And nor do we require people who come to the Supper Club to agree with it. It's just a salon of discussing ideas. That's it. So because of the SPLC, Eventbrite canceled our event, so we weren't even allowed to meet. We had to scramble really quickly and get rid of all third-party event platforms and remake it ourselves and redo it. And we rescued the event, but it was only but it was barely. And we'll never go back to that strategy again. But I guess my point is this has genuine, real, censorious effects on the national culture.
Well, and this is one of the many things that's driving us apart as a civil society. Like, I support the idea of companies like Eventbrite that facilitate events like this. I think, new companies like Uber and Lyft that transform the way that our taxi system works, that, we should be thinking outside the box and empowering through the free market various ways to solve problems and come together as a society. Unfortunately, we're starting to balkanize. We're starting to have entire ecosystems of companies, of tech sectors, that this is conservative coded and this is liberal coded, and never the two shall meet. And I think that's very negative for our society. I think there there are important things that we can learn from one another. And the more we get demonized and divided, and I think the SPLC is exhibit A of that division, and it really undermines our civil society when you have groups that come together that just want to discuss issues, that want to have a discussion, that want to champion parental rights or, oppose COVID mandates, but are willing to talk about it and find other health solutions for people. Like this, that is key civil society, and the SPLC is systematically quashing it because it opposes their agenda.
Yeah, I have not read the indictment. Part of the reason is that I knew I was interviewing you so that you would just kind of give me the cliff.
Sure. But I could go through. Yeah.
But what is the deal with the Klan? I mean, is it correct the SPLC was actually paying like one of the Grand Dragons or one of the leaders of the Klan? Is that correct?
So, yes, that is correct, according to the indictment. Now, I do need to step back a little bit and say that the SPLC has their defenses of this. Their defense is that they were running an informant program, that they only paid these people to rat out the Klan and prevent violent attacks ahead of time. But the indictment says that the money that the SPLC gave to these people was then used to buy Klan robes and Klan hoods, that this money was then used to reimburse people for cross burnings. I mean, that is where we are at with the SPLC right now. And the SPLC, to my knowledge, has not definitively, denied or much less disproven those claims. Now they'll get their chance in court, and I really hope that they do. I mean, the SPLC CEO was questioned about those claims yesterday in Congress in a testimony, and he refused to say. He said those claims will be addressed in the Middle District of Alabama. And it's like, okay, but we want to know if you were funding Klan robes. We want to know if it is true that one of your employees was in a romantic relationship with a neo-Nazi member who you say was your informant. Okay, but this employee was in a relationship with this person and allegedly used the funds that the SPLC gave this informant for informant activities to pay their living expenses. So, these claims are really serious that the SPLC is dealing with. And what we've been hearing from the left over and over again, and, I understand Brownstone is not specifically conservative. I do hope many members of your audience are, liberal themselves. But what we're hearing from Democrats is that there's nothing to see here, that big, mean Trump administration is persecuting the poor little SPLC for disagreeing with the Trump administration.
It's predictably partisan, and it's so pathetic. I mean, the Democrats just really need to give it up. I mean, defending SPLC at this point. But these people are so absurd. The Trump derangement syndrome has disabled their brains. They can't even admit that the reflecting pool looks better.
I work in DC. I walk by Union Station, and I was frankly flabbergasted to see how much better Union Station looks. Walk outside Union Station, there are fountains with water that look pretty. I mean, this is.
I mean, credit where it's due. I mean, just say Union Station's better. The reflecting pool is more beautiful than it used to be when it was moldy and green. The SPLC is gone
the SPLC is smearing good people. Like these are basic things you should be able to agree with. And yes, you can make the claim that you disagree with some of the people the SPLC smears, but like the notion that because you disagree with the left, you should be on a map with Klan chapters put out by a group that says the map shows the infrastructure upholding white supremacy in this country. I mean, it's beyond the pale. Anyway, the indictment, which you didn't read, which, it's long, but the main things are wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy to conceal money laundering. And so the wire fraud charges are the most, you have to tell the story, you have to approve the narrative. And many legal observers are saying this is going to be a heavy lift because you essentially have to prove that the SPLC intended to lie to their donors by propping up hate in order to fundraise against it. That's the basic claim.
But that kind of sounds like that's what's going on, though. I mean,
I think it is exactly what's going on.
Yeah,
but
I mean,
the problem is proving it.
It's it's one thing to pay an informant, which you think of an informant as like a typist or a low level employee. But if your informant is the head of the organization who's organizing rallies and distributing Klan stuff and whatever, at some point you're actually funding the thing, against which you're raising money to fight, and so it becomes just an absurdity.
When some of these so-called informants were also featured in extremist profiles. So, I talked to, I mean, it's like you are increasing their platform. And, and this is a thing that people on the left have complained about the SPLC about in the past, because they say that even if it's good for the SPLC to monitor and then report on any sort of violence that might come to law enforcement, that there's a problem when you are exaggerating an organization's influence. Like, let's say the Aryan Nations is about to die, but the SPLC writes a report and says, oh, hate is on the march, and this leads to more donors giving to the SPLC. But maybe there are a few, racists on the edge who see that report and say, oh, maybe I want to join the Aryan Nations.
Yeah, and it bolsters it, right? Yeah. Right. Well, Tyler, now your 2020 book, now how far back in time are we going here? Can you just tell, when was SPLC founded? Was there ever a time when it seemed like, the salad days when they were doing good work? And yes. How far back have they been funding right-wing, racist, white supremacist organizations, literature, and groups?
So the SPLC starts in the 1970s. And originally it started with the mission of being a public interest legal foundation. So what they would do is as the name suggests, they provided legal representation to poor people in the South. And they would do that for white people who claimed reverse discrimination. They would do that for black men on death row who were unjustly there. And they got people off. I mean, there are a lot of really good cases in the SPLC's early years where they did the work that I think they should still be doing. I mean, and here and there, they may claim that they do it. And I think everybody deserves legal representation. And if you are a nonprofit and your goal is to provide legal representation to people who can't otherwise afford it, that is a noble mission in my mind. But then in the 1980s, they represented people, and to be clear, this is also a noble thing that they did. There were people who were victimized by Klan groups. Now, this was the 1980s, so the Klan groups were weak, and sometimes they barely existed. But there were still lynchings that happened in the 1980s. And so there was a lynching of a man by the name of Michael Donald. And the SPLC represented Michael Donald's bereaved mother, who sued the Klan group into bankruptcy. And the SPLC successfully got them bankrupted. Now, even here, though, there are a lot of revealing facts, because this is a noble case the SPLC took up. But when they sued the Klan into bankruptcy, the Klan barely existed. It had 50 grand to their name. SPLC attorneys said that suing the Klan into bankruptcy was so easy, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. And so the Klan barely existed. Bula Mae Donald, who in court is given a $7 million settlement, receives 50 grand. The SPLC, meanwhile, goes to their donors and says, we got a $7 million settlement. And lo and behold, the millions flow in from across the country because they're fighting Grand Dragons. Then Bula Mae Donald takes that money, and what does she do with it? Well, she pays the Southern Poverty Law Center, which had given her a loan for her home. So the vast majority of the money that she received in this settlement went back to the SPLC. Now, granted, giving her a loan was probably a nice thing, but the story doesn't end there. She wants to make a movie about the story, but so does Morris Dees. Guess whose movie gets made? And guess whose movie edged out the other potential documentary? Because once Morris Dees had his big movie deal, nobody wanted a movie deal from Beulah May Donald. So even in this case, which the SPLC often cites as one of their biggest victories, because it was, you start to see an organization that is focused on raising money and not as focused on, and at least from my mind, not as focused on actually helping the little guy. And at this time also, SPLC's legal team, in 1985, SPLC's legal team quits en masse. And they say that Morris Dees is focusing on suing the Klan because it plays well with donors, and he's drifting away from the SPLC's original mission. So the SPLC, when you ask where did they fall off the rails, the real answer is decades before a lot of the stuff we've been covering. Now, that's the first answer. And even that answer, it's still noble to go after the Klan. Like, don't get me wrong. The Klan is the definition of a hate group in America. And I'm glad that many of these groups got sued into bankruptcy by the SPLC. But what we see here is a clear shift in mission. And then the SPLC, they run out of grand dragons to slay. And that's where the real, the horrible corruption comes. In the 1990s and the early 2000s, they start going after, groups like skinheads who I think they were legitimately racist, but they're not quite the Klan. And then you look in the early 2000s, they start, and by the way, during this period, occasionally they're going after pro-lifers, they're going after some other people on the right. In the 2000s, they start putting out their hate map. And at first, they're only putting out on it groups like Jihad Watch and the, what's it called? The David Horowitz Freedom Center, where they're saying these groups are anti-Muslim. Then they start putting on their anti-immigrant groups. And this is in the 2000s where, the movement against illegal immigration had not been fully developed. And so you have a few
it
of
was
these.
sketchy back in those days. I mean, to be anti-immigration, and by the way, look, my own mea culpas. I've my own view on this immigration issue has changed. But I remember a time when to be skeptical of immigration was to be considered, just a hater. That you could only have racist motivations for that. So I could see how they would target that. And by the way, you skipped over skinheads. I completely forgotten about skinhead scare. I mean, we don't even talk about skinheads anymore, but there was a time when skinheads were taking over the country, I remember.
Yeah, I don't think they were ever as big as the SPLC made them out to be. But I'm not quite as familiar with the skinhead era. You might know more about that than I do. I was a child at the time. Yeah. So the things that really drove me to write the book about the SPLC is when in 2010 and onward, they started putting conservative Christian groups on the hate map, calling them anti-gay groups and then anti-LGBTQ plus groups. And they've gone so far off the deep end on this anti-LGBTQ plus thing that Gays Against Groomers, which is a group of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people who oppose the sexualization of children, they're on the hate map as an anti-LGBTQ plus hate group. Wow. So when you talk about, how far they've gone off the reservation, I think that's a good marker that they might not be on the level here. But they also have groups, like they're groups of doctors who oppose so-called gender-affirming care, which, I think the science is still developing, but most of the signs that we've seen, the Department of Health and Human Services put out a very good report last year talking about all the documented harms and the very questionable, the very weak evidence for any positive impacts of this. There are groups of doctors who oppose so-called gender-affirming care, and they're on the hate map now alongside Klan chapters because they oppose the SPLC's transgender agenda. And the SPLC, by the way, they have a 1-2 punch. They have an education arm called Learning for Justice. It used to be called Teaching Tolerance, but then around 2021, amid peak woke, they decided tolerance wasn't woke enough for them, and they had to switch their name to Learning for Justice. But this group pushes questionable and controversial racial lessons that trace back to critical race theory and transgender ideology. And these things, like, I can understand some people might think about them, but when you, at the same time as the SPLC pushes this, they're also putting people who disagree with those issues on their hate map. So they have this 1-2 punch where they're advocating for one thing, and then if you dare disagree, you're on the hate map with chapters of the Klan and part of the infrastructure upholding white supremacy. And that's how they enforce their agenda, their ideology in the public square.
Well, unless of course you make really nice with SPLC and go to them and say, I tell you what, why don't I become an informant? And then you can become in effect an employee, right? What is the story with? I seem to remember when all this stuff came out that they established a whole series of shell companies to launder the money. Maybe that's the second indictment.
That's the second part of the indictment. So the indictment is 11 counts. First counts is wire fraud, allegedly lying to donors about what their money went to. The second count is bank fraud. And that's where the SPLC set up these shell companies. And then they have, and I mean, if these indictments are accurate, and I have no reason to suspect they are not, the DOJ has the SPLC dead to rights. There's an employee who writes in an affidavit that I am the owner of X shell company. And they're telling this to an FDIC insured bank. Then a few years later, the SPLC CEO signs another indictment or another statement to that very same bank saying, no, these accounts were owned and operated by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which right there, like, we know what happened, what really took down some of the big mafia bosses. It wasn't that they could prove murder and rape and all these things. It was that they could prove false statements on tax returns. And there's a reason why our legal system takes bank fraud and has very serious charges with it, because this is often a way that prosecutors can go after people who are doing other unsavory things and very negative things for society and nail them on something as mundane as making a false statement to a bank. And then, of course, there's conspiracy to commit money laundering, and associated with both the fraud charges and the conspiracy to commit money laundering charges, there's a new section in the superseding indictment that talks about forfeiture of assets, and that any assets obtained through activity that the SPLC is convicted of regarding wire fraud can be seized by the United States government. When you're talking about an $800 million organization that has been fundraising, allegedly, according to the government, with taking some of their donors' money and funding it into the same things the SPLC claims to exist to oppose for a period of 10 years, from 2010 to 2023, if all of that fundraising money that they got in those 13 years gets seized by the federal government, this organization, it's hard for me to see how they continue to exist.
What are some of the, I recall being amused by some of the names of the shell companies. Do you recall any offhand?
Yes. Well, one of them, the initials are CIA. Yes. So throughout the indictment, they have the CIA paid for X, the CIA paid for Y. And one of them is called Fox Photography. I remember that one. But yeah, I mean, it's just very anodyne. One of them is an education themed name. So it's like a Rare Books Foundation or something like that, where these people were instructed to say, if asked where the money comes, they say, well, I've been tutoring college students on my extra time.
Yeah. So the idea is that you go to the bank and say, I'm you know a rare books company. Okay, here's your bank account. And now the SPLC starts pouring money into you and says, okay, here's $1 million, or here's $100,000 10 times, whatever the thing is, and now you've got money to pay. The Grand Dragon, the Klan, the organizer of the Charlottesville thing. You can, you buy the robes and so you have what? How many of these shell companies exist? A dozen, 2 dozen, something like that? Do we know?
I think it was less than 10 in the original indictment.
Less than 10. Okay.
I need to look again at the exact number.
So
it's
we
not
don't.
very many.
There's going to be discovery, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So already right now, where it is in the system, there's a court date for the trial, which is set for October 5th, which just so happens to be my birthday. And then in the lead up to that, you have many different motions that they have. So the SPLC has a motion for dismissal for vindictive prosecution. And this one is interesting because to his credit, in my mind, Kash Patel came out and said, the FBI will never rely on the Southern Poverty Law Center ever again. He did this after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. I think it was very important that he made this statement. But of course, the SPLC is now saying that this statement is evidence of animus and that they're being prosecuted because they oppose the Trump administration. And it's like, well, no, you're being prosecuted because of the claims in the indictment. But yes, I do think that it is fair for a government official to come out and say that you're a morally bankrupt smear factory. Like there is truth to that.
Well, Tyler, too, isn't it? Let's back up slightly. What exactly was the relationship between the FBI and the SPLC before? Do you understand what that was?
Yes. So the SPLC repeatedly fed information to law enforcement. That is not itself a bad thing. But when it comes to certain sources, I think you can remember in 2023, there was that notorious anti-Catholic memo that came out of the FBI Richmond office, where they said that certain traditional Catholics are comparable to domestic terrorists and they should be monitored. We should have the FBI placing field sources in their churches. And all of that was based on the SPLC, on a very old report, ironically, that the SPLC had written. And I talked to members of the traditionalist Catholic segment of our country, and they said, oh yeah, that information is very outdated. Some of those groups don't exist anymore. But nevertheless, this was used to go after Catholics. Meanwhile, in the Biden administration, the real threat is with the overall DOJ, where there was a very close relationship, especially between the SPLC and Kristen Clark, who headed the Civil Rights Division under the Department of Justice. Kristen Clark made a very big trip to SPLC headquarters, to the Poverty Palace in Montgomery. She met with a lot of people. She asked for advice from SPLC CEO Margaret Wong. And Margaret Wong, by the way, was bragging to donors in 2021 that the new Biden administration, many of the agencies, had reached out to her for advice on how to combat the domestic terror threat. And then, of course, we see later that prosecutors were actually briefed on the anti-LGBTQ movement by none other than the SPLC staffer, who would later justify putting focus on the family on the hate map. Now, I don't know what the religious persuasion of your audience is, but for those who might not know, Focus on the Family is one of the oldest, most respected conservative Christian
it's an evangelical organization. It was actually it dates from the 80s, right? My overall impression of it is that it was a moderate moral majority, that it was just like the name says, focus on the family. It was
So the interesting thing is there was a time when the SPLC agreed with you that they were more moderate. And there was a time when, after the SPLC was accused of being anti-Christian, the SPLC thought it would make sense to have an FAQ page. On their FAQ page, they had a section that said, is the SPLC anti-Christian? And the SPLC said, no, we're not anti-Christian. We don't attack people for their beliefs. We only attack people for vilifying people like LGBTQ people. Well, suddenly, around last year, that language disappeared from their website. And lo and behold, they added focus on the family to their hate map. So by the SPLC's own admission, a tacit admission to be sure, I think it is fair to say that they are anti-Christian, because the only piece of evidence they gave to rebut that claim was not putting focus on there. But focus, is, and you're right, they were more on the moderate side, and the SPLC themselves said so until they decided that it was they were too. The way I see it, they claimed that focus on the family changed, but from my vantage point, it was the SPLC that became too radical to even consider focus on the family.
Well, these days, if you say Union Station's been beautified, that's considered to be right-wing hate. But for all the world, days, Tyler, for all the world, Tyler, I swear this looks to me like an organization that became so sort of voracious for fundraising that they ended up having to create the problem, or at least heavily subsidize the problem. That they were seeking to get rid of. And as you're speaking, I'm just thinking about the Biden years and before, how this line that the country was being overtaken by deplorables. This was, I think, Hillary Clinton's line from
the bitter clingers, the deplorables, the dregs,
and
all
then
those who were.
And then Biden gave several super scary talks about the rise of hate and white supremacy in this country. And so, one wonders like how much of that was actually emanating from SPLC's headquarters and strategy books.
That's an excellent question. And to be honest, I mean, I'm very glad to see that we have this indictment, so that hopefully in the process of discovery, we can get some answers as to how much of the hate that Biden campaigned against, that he said was a domestic terror threat, was really being propped up by the SPLC. But the main thing that always galls me is that, even if the SPLC didn't increase it that much, even if there was enough, real grassroots hate, so to speak, that these are threats here and there, the SPLC is smearing mainstream people who go to school board meetings, who run for school board, who, write policy papers, and putting them on the same map as members of the Klan. And as you said, not presenting any sort of tiered, explanation that says, oh yeah, well, we disagree with these people, but they're not violent haters who are going to show up and, try to attack people. They don't do that. I think they intentionally want this guilt by association attack to silence the voices of anyone who dares disagree with their agenda, because they are so convinced that they are in the right, that they are on the side of the angels, that no dissent is allowed. And that's a very dangerous place to be.
Tyler, in my research, and my book, by the way, is called Right-Wing Collectivism, The Other Threat to Liberty, and you're welcome to read it. I mean, it's actually got a lot of good research in it. I feel like I need to put out a new edition that excludes all the gibberish that I got from SPLC. As it turns out, but I stopped in 1946, and my sort of historical reconstruction, my sort of breadcrumb intellectual reconstruction of what I was calling right collectivism. But after World War II, there were some rather emergent, rather famous not too famous. I mean, they're always tiny and always kind of marginal, but sort of neo-Nazi organizations in America. I don't know. I can't even remember the names of them, but like National Front, and there was a novelist who I think was a physicist and wrote a book, and that inspired Tim McVeigh and ended up in the 95 Oklahoma bombing, all this kind of stuff. So there was this nascent rightist movement in the country. But it was always marginal. It was curious, and probably ultimately dangerous movement, but never, of course, it never left the margins of society. But what I'm interested in is whether and to what extent. Well, let me ask you this: in your research, do you have any documentation of how far back the SPLC's sort of pain of informants goes? Like, how much of these movements since the, say, late, mid to late 80s and 90s and on were actually, in some sense, propped up by some of what SPLC's was doing? Do you have any sense of that?
Yes. So the informant program, from various legal sources related to the indictment, and I'm going to have to go in a couple minutes.
Sorry,
but the informant program traces back to the early 1980s, and that makes sense because the SPLC offices were firebombed at that time. And so this is, when we're discussing an issue like this, I do always want to acknowledge that there are some violent, radical, extremist, white supremacists out there that have posed a real threat to other people and to the SPLC in the past. And so it stands to reason that they started this informant program. But at some point, according to the indictment, and I think according to common sense, given what the SPLC has done in other contexts, they saw this informant program as an opportunity to exaggerate the hate that they fundraise against.
And we're waiting to see exactly how, to what extent that happened. I mean, I would love to just get a sense of like how, what is the degree here? How much? And I guess we're going to know more in discovery and the trial. Is the discovery documents going to be made public? How does this work?
Sorry, you have to repeat that. You're also breaking up a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. The documents from discovery, is that going to be something the public will have access to?
Yes. So the way that these things often work, it is up to the Department of Justice whether they release the documents in discovery, and it is up to the SPLC whether they release them. Given the high nature of the public interest in this case, I have a very high confidence that many documents will be released. The question is how many, the question is when, the question is, and sometimes the documents are held under seal by the court, but to my understanding, that's a rare phenomenon.
Extraordinary. Thank you so much, Tyler, for being with me today and for your wonderful research. Your book is called Making Hate Pay, I believe. And
yes.
So pick it up, read it, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you. And I updated it with a new chapter that released last month. So even though it is originally from 2020, I like to say 2020 and 2026.
Perfect.
So,
thank you, Tyler.